Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see you here for the last session of day 2 of Learning Technologies Live 2022. It's been wonderful to actually see real people, for the first time in a couple of years. My name is Sheena Wyatt from Kapow, your super business coach. I'm your chair today. But who cares, because you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to the fabulous Andrew and Liz, who are going to talk to you about podcasting and the value to creating valuable podcasts. So I'm going to shut up for now. But we're going to be doing something very different in this session, and I will let Andrew tell you all about it. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. So first and foremost, great energy, thank you. Because it is so easy for people to go, no, I won't go to that room, I'll just go around, I'll follow it down and go home. So thank you. So thank you for being here, because that means that you all want to be here. You're not here just because, which I really appreciate. So thank you. My name is Andrew Jacobs. I'm an independent learning consultant. I've got 30 years experience in L&D. And about 2 years ago, I realized I listened to so many hours of podcasts. How could we use them for learning? Quick show of hands. Who listens to podcasts? Okay, so we're above the norm in this room. We'll go through that in a minute. But I realized that we could actually use them for learning. So what we're going to do in this session today is, we'll just do a little bit of, come on, slide, move. There we go. 4 things, why now? So why should we be doing podcasting now? And we'll just talk about some of the context around it. Give you some clues around planning it. Does anybody produce podcasts at the moment? Cool. Anybody thinking of producing podcasts? Oh, there we go. That's why you're here. So we'll talk about all the mistakes you have in planning it and the things you need to think about. We'll talk about recording, and we'll then talk about distribution as well. So how you get them to the people you need, whether it be internal, external, and so on. And then what we'll do is we're going to do a recording. So I produce a podcast called Women Talking About Learning. I fundamentally disagree with the speakers we have in learning and development. So I won't speak at any event unless there is at least an equal split of male and female speakers. Won't contribute to any articles about it, about learning, unless there is an equal split of men and women at least. And I realised about 2 years ago that there were no podcasts, and one of the reasons with women speaking on learning and development, and one of the reasons was because nobody's producing one. So I produced a podcast called Women Talking About Learning, which is purely for women to talk about learning. And it's great to see some of the guests in the room as well. Helen, Leor, people who've been on the podcast. Liz has also been a podcast guest as well. And I learned the wrong way of how to build a podcast. So what you've got here is 2 years experience of, well, why podcasts and how we can use them differently. So why now, first of all? So I think we need to think about designing our learning activity differently. I see a lot of investment in video and people wanting to produce lots of video stuff. What tends to happen is somebody will then start playing the video, watch the first 12 or 13 seconds, and then switch to another tab. And will then carry on doing whatever else they're doing while the audio is playing. So the question for me is, well, why don't you just produce the audio properly anyway? Why are you investing all that money in video? So there's something there about, well, listening whenever and wherever. So actually, I can listen when I'm doing something else, or I can go away and concentrate on it. Listening might be better than watching or reading. It's interesting looking at some of the data around it and how we receive information. A really polished video with poor audio is actually worse, or perceived as being worse, than having just good audio. If you've got good audio, people will think that it's better, even if the person speaking with the poor audio is more experienced. Some interesting data on it. You get a professor who's got high experience and high quality content, but with bad audio, people will believe that less than if they've got somebody who doesn't know about a topic, just reading off a script, but has the best audio going. It's easy to keep informed. I can turn a podcast around in about 15 minutes from finishing recording. It doesn't take a long time when you get used to doing it. So actually being able to put information out there quickly, which people can access, is really important. It's cheaper and easier in video as well. And like I say, it's an underused channel. I find it interesting. I said show of hands who's listening or looking at listening to podcasts. Pretty much everybody in the room put their hands up. This is really interesting data. This comes from a site called Pod News. And this is for 2022, winter 2021, sorry, the end of last winter, so just coming into this year. Podcasts listened to about 30% of the population. Most of your employees are going to be in the 25 to 54 age group. A quarter of your employees will be listening to podcasts. So you're not going to be asking people to do something a quarter of them think is particularly different. Like it says, the number of people listening has gone up. There's a slight flattening of the curve between 20 and 21 because lockdown, quite simply. And interestingly, a lot of people will be commuting when they are listening to podcasts. Hands up, who listens to podcasts on a commute? Yeah, nice place to listen to them. Interestingly, more men listen to podcasts than women, but there are more women than men in the audience today. Which I think is interesting. And like I said before, only 16% of people don't do anything else when they're listening to a podcast. So if people are doing activity at work and they've got video playing, why are you creating video? You might as well do it as audio. And also 50% of podcast listening is done at home. We're thinking about working flexibly, we're thinking about people working a hybrid way. Well, 50% is done at home, 50% on the way to the work or the workplace. It's a medium that covers all of them. So I think we're in a good place. More people are listening to them, more people are aware of them. So, planning it. So I set up a podcast and I didn't have a plan. Oh wow, that really wasn't a good idea. So, some of the things you need to think about. First one to talk about on the left-hand side there is purpose. So what is the purpose of your podcast? And you should be able to just go quite easily, it is X. Purpose of Women Talking About Learning is to amplify women's voices in learning and development. There you go. So what's the purpose of your podcast? If you want to produce podcasts around leadership and management, it's to inform our leadership candidates on what the organisation's doing, or whatever. A simple tagline purpose that you can then attach everything to. If you haven't got a purpose, you end up with aimless podcasts. Boy, I've listened to some of those. Mainly from middle-aged white men. Talk about beer, and then football, and then food and beer, and food and football, and beer and football. And by the 6th episode, you just don't want to listen to them anymore. So what's your purpose? Have a clear purpose, and then that makes it a lot easier to design what you want. What's the style of podcast going to be? One of the things about Women Talking About Learning, which is quite unique, is that it is entirely open for women to do what they want. If they want to interview each other, they can do that. If they just want to have a chat, they can do that. They can do whatever they want in the space. But what are you going to be doing in terms of style? Do you want to do an interview style? Do you want to do a magazine style? Do you want to have a solo storytelling style? What's the style that you would like the podcast to be? Think about the podcast you like and think about, well, how would that engage people? Talking heads on audio are just as dull as talking heads on video. Just bear that in mind. Don't turn a Zoom call into a podcast. Please don't turn a Zoom call into a podcast. So we'll get that on here now so nobody goes away and goes, yeah, this guy said we could use Zoom calls as podcasts. Don't do that. Don't just record them and turn them into a podcast as they are. Think about your recording schedule. So, when you're going to be recording, it was really easy for me to go, yeah, I'm going to produce them once a week. And then suddenly realised, God, how am I going to record this much content every week? So what's your schedule? And think about how you're going to be putting it out there in terms of production. Is it going to be a seasonal one or is it going to be enduring? Are you going to produce a series of 6 and then have a pause and then do another series of 6? Or are you going to have this purpose running through every podcast on a monthly basis, fortnightly basis, first Tuesday of the month basis, whatever the schedule is that you're putting together? So be really clear on what you would like the production, the season to be, and that will tie in with your style. Think about your music. Do you have music? If you haven't got any corporate music, You might need to think about doing some. Great idea for co-production. Ask people in your organisation, does anybody know how to do music? Can we come up with a jingle for what our podcast is? Don't go out and buy a 2-minute, 30-second bit of audio, because you don't need 2 minutes of 30 seconds of audio at the start of a podcast. If it's more than 15 seconds, people will skip it. So what you want is 15 seconds of music that you can use at the start and at the end, and occasionally to put in bits in the middle. Any more than 15 seconds is probably going to be a waste. So don't do that. Somebody contacted me and said, listen to this. I went, yeah, great, listen to it. And it's 2 minutes 40. I'm like, when are they going to start talking? 3 minutes 20, when are they going to start talking? It's a 4-minute 15 intro. It's like, no, skip. Who's your host going to be? And who are your guests? So who's going to be the person hosting? Are you going to have a common voice? Are you going to have different hosts? You're going to have the same person speaking all the time? Again, think about how you can represent here. Don't just use a white, middle-aged man's voice to launch your podcast. Think about how you can bring some diversity into it. Again, one of the things we want to do is we want to role model different ways of doing things. The Women in Learning session yesterday talked about it. But think about how you can help represent people. And then also think about your equipment. Do you have any recording equipment? If you're just recording over your laptop microphone, it's going to sound crap. Sorry. It will. If you're recording on your headset mic, it will sound better, but still probably a bit crap. The only way to do that, improve it, is to move the mic from here to here. If you have it recording here, people will still hear you, but you won't end up with big popping noises, pop, 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 which comes through when people breathe through the mic here. Better, just buy a good microphone, a decent condenser, dynamic microphone, a decent dynamic microphone will cost you about 70 or 80 quid, and it will sound amazing. You'll get a chance to hear because we're going to do a recording. You'll hear the results. When you do come to record it, where? So, have you got a quiet room? Or is the ambience of the podcast that actually you're going to have a bit of background noise? Have you got quiet space? Can you go to the same space every time? When you're going to record, think about when you're going to distribute. There's no point recording something now for distribution in 6 weeks' time if there's a big event going to happen in between. Think about the context. Is this still valid? I did this recording. Should I still be using it? Do I need to think about editing it? Where are you going to back up your podcasts? The worst thing in the world is when you realise you haven't hit record, or worse, you delete the file and haven't backed it up. Hands up who's done that? Yeah. Yeah. So make sure you've got good backup on it. Are you going to do them live, face-to-face, or are you going to do them online? Think about how you're going to be doing the recording. You could do them online, you could do them online through Zoom, but actually it's quite nice to go and meet people, particularly if you've just got a microphone. Think about your intro and your outro. So how are you going to introduce your podcast? Because those first 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 words will be the thing that people will go, yeah, I'm going to listen to it, or no, I'm not going to listen to it. So what's your intro going to be? Similarly, what's your outro going to be? Are you going to, every week, say what's going to be next week, or are you not? Be consistent in terms of branding. And that's important in terms of your editing time as well, because you could pre-record your intro. I used to. Pre-record my intro, and you would pre-record the outro and just stuck them on the end on each. It just sounded really fake, so decided not to. Editing time is really important though. When I first started, it took a ratio of about 6:1. So for every minute of recording, it took about 6 minutes of editing. So for a half-hour podcast, I was there for 3.5 hours. But I learned how to do it. It does get quicker. Now I can turn them around, like I say, in 15 minutes or so. But it does take practice. So think about how you're going to edit them. Yeah, and who do you know who might have editing experience? And then where you're going to distribute it. So you can make them internal. So a really interesting idea where an organisation was saying, what we're going to do is produce a series of leadership and management podcasts. So people will listen to the podcast and will then complete an activity. And will then come together as a cohort to discuss the activity before they then went and listen to the next podcast. So those would be internal only podcasts, which everybody within that cohort will be able to access, but they were built and designed around an activity and then meeting face to face or online in order to be able to discuss it. Mental design. That makes perfect sense to me. Just a really different way of doing it. It's not homework, it's actually saying, here's a podcast series, have a listen through. Or are you going to publish them externally? Where do you want to put them? Do you want to put them out there? If you are going to publish them externally, you need to think about publishing the first one a good few weeks before you want the proper first episode to go out, because it takes a couple of weeks for Apple to pick up all of the feeds and stuff in order for them to then become available and live. So when you first publish a podcast, it might be 3 or 4 days. You go, yeah, a podcast is out. No, it's not. 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. Yeah, now a podcast is out. Just think about stuff like that. So always do a pilot episode. If you do a pilot episode, you go, well, podcast is going to be coming out. You'll see all these pilot episodes. It's because what they're doing is they're using that to test their XML feed to make sure the feed works through to all the distributors. So we're going to have a podcast coming out. It's for 3 minutes, but once it's landed, then everybody knows where it is. But what it's done is establish the feed from their platform through to Apple or Google or wherever else the podcast is going to. Nobody told me that. I didn't know that. So I've gone, first podcast. No, not first podcast. 5 days. What platform are you going to use? If you're going to do them externally, you're probably going to want to use an external platform. Buzzsprout is a very good platform. Podbean is another very good platform. And they've got different levels of membership. Some of them are free. You can just record up to a couple of hours and then they become available. If you want to do more recording, then you need to buy from those platforms. Benefit of them is they're a one-stop shop for you to be able to upload. You don't upload directly to Apple, you upload to Podbean, and then that distributes it to Apple, Spotify, and everywhere else. Think about, do you want to put it on Spotify? Spotify's been challenged over their ethics. Some music artists have pulled their recordings from Spotify. I pulled Women Talking About Learning from Spotify. Do you want your brand to be associated with them? Difference it made to listenership was about 6% of my listeners came from Spotify. And those people then found other channels. Talking about listeners, who are they? Find out who your listeners are. So don't be afraid to ask people, are they listening to it? And to do that, you need to understand the data. So who is listening, when are they listening, where are they listening? And make sure you go to a good place to pick the data up. Buzzsprout offers particularly good data, which is why I like Buzzsprout. Podbean, slightly less good, but still useful. But find out who your listeners are. Think of your socials that go around it as well. You see, I've got their social media. How are you going to put this out there? If you're doing it externally, how are you going to publicise it? And you will have to publicise it, because there's a lot of noise. A lot of noise about podcasts. So make sure you get it out there. One thing I ask all of my guests to do, Helen knows, Leo knows, is that when I put it out there is market it. Put it on LinkedIn. Here's a little video. Put this out there as well. And then success criteria. What would it look like? What would good success criteria look like? So, my target for Women Talking About Learning was, I had a target of 6 episodes. That was my success criteria. And we're currently at 44. 44 went live this week. Our target was 500 listeners. And it says 8.5, it's near 8.8 now. So 99,000 listeners. In 70 countries. We've had 90 odd guests, who are the people in the background, from all over the place. I've had people recording, I had a Chicago and Singapore on the same day. So finding what time to record that was really interesting, because it was really early for one person, really late for somebody else. So it can be global. So think about that in terms of your guests. Have you got any questions? I expect you've got loads. So, I'm not going to answer any questions. Actually, what would be much more useful is if you ask Sheena and Liz your questions. So, one of the reasons I wanted to do this session was I want to record an episode for Women Talking About Learning. So this will be the Q&A one. All the titles for women talking about learning, someone says they're friends titles. It's the misogyny one, the visual design one, etc. This is the Q&A one. You are in the Q&A one now. However, I haven't been recording any of this. What we're going to do is record the next part, which is the questions and answers. So think about the questions that you might have, and Sheena and Liz are going to answer them for you. So you don't need to listen to a middle-aged white bloke telling you all about this stuff when I've got two really smart women here who know how to do it. So, Sheena and Liz. Let's just turn this on. Cool. I know it's a bit bright, isn't it? For those people asking, this microphone cost me £12 on eBay. This foam insert is part of a pack of 5, cost me a tenner, and they're orange and blue, my corporate colours. The cable comes with the microphone. They're going into a recorder that's a bit expensive, it's about 120 quid. That's all you need to record a podcast. Awesome. Let me just make sure we're recording. Excellent. So, when I record women talking about learning, we record the content, and then I tag on the intro and the outro bit at the end. And that's all I'm going to do with this as well. So, what questions have you got? Well, firstly, actually, Liz, what have I been talking about that's wrong, or what do you want to add to it? The reason for it is because Liz produced a podcast. Liz, explain who you are.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Liz Drury. I'm a freelance voiceover artist. I record a lot of e-learning narration, hence my interest in L&D, and that's how Andrew and I got to know each other. And I've been producing a podcast called Small Business, Big Network for just over a year now, which, as the name suggests, is for small business owners who want to get more from their networking. And I don't think you said anything wrong, Andrew, at all. But there are different ways of doing things. So, I use a different platform to you. I use Captivate. So, whatever questions you've got about podcasting, we will do our best to answer.
Sheena, from a learning perspective, anything you would add?
Yes, I would. I mean, I think that one of the things that makes a podcast a really useful ingredient in your learning mix is that people can access it anytime. And, as we are increasingly time poor, being able to share small nuggets and tips, and be able to focus on some of the really specific learning objectives for your organisation or your department or our businesses, which is how Liz and I know each other, is something to really bring into that mix. It really is a great way to get your point across.
Magic. I saw a hand go up over here. Oh, I'll come to you in a moment, sir. Shannon first. There you go, take the mic.
So have you found that there is...
Oh, just realised what mute. I'll mute it. There we go.
Have you found that there is an ideal time? I realize that it depends, most likely, but is there a sweet spot, perhaps, that you've found where people tune in or tune out, or when they drop off?
So, is there an ideal time? Do you mean in terms of publishing your podcast?
Length.
The length of the podcast?
Yeah, the finished product.
Yeah. So I decided with my podcast that I didn't want it to be too long. I myself listen to podcasts when I'm walking my dog. And my dog walk lasts 30 to 40 minutes. So a podcast that's going to fit into that period of time is appealing to me. I also didn't want to spend hours and hours recording my podcast because I don't have time to do that. So my episodes tend to be around 20, 25 minutes, which I think people can fit in while they're doing another activity, whether they're doing the washing up or hanging up the washing or walking the dog like I am, or on their commute. And so that's, it's a really easy bite-sized piece of content that people can consume. And, if they're doing something for a longer period of time, well, they can listen to more than one.
Thank you.
Go on, Helen. I'll get to you in a moment, sir.
How do you help your audience prepare for a podcast? So to tease out all those experience, the tips that you want to highlight in the podcast?
So help the audience to prepare, did you say?
The people on the podcast that you've
People on
invited.
the podcast.
Yes.
So my guests. Well, do you know, I tend to not give them too much information in advance. So I will tell them the format of the podcast and what's going to happen and how we're going to connect with each other. But I don't ever give them any questions that I'm going to ask them. And there's two reasons for that. The first one is I never write the questions till the last minute anyway. But also, I don't want people to prepare a speech because that sounds very unnatural. And the style of my podcast is very much a conversation. And I want my listeners to feel like they are eavesdropping on our conversation. And, you know, I didn't know what you were going to ask me just then, so I've no idea what I'm going to say till I'm saying it. And that's just so much more natural. And, you know, that's what I want my podcast to be like. So I have had some people who are really a bit nervous say, oh, will you tell me what the questions are going to be? And I'll say, well, the questions are not going to be difficult. I'm going to ask you about you, about your business, about how you network for your business. You know all the answers. You don't need to prepare something. And so the only time they get to hear what the questions are going to be are literally just before we record. I will run through very briefly, this is what I've outlined to ask you, just in case there's something in there that they don't want to be asked. But that's the first time they've heard the questions, is just before I'm going to ask them, and it leads to a very natural sounding conversation.
I think there's also something to add there from a learning perspective. If you've got somebody that you're bringing into your podcast who is a subject matter expert and you're wanting to pull that out, is also just having a conversation with them beforehand so that it doesn't become their show, if you see what I mean, so that they have the context of what you're wanting to bring out for your audience, and it's not just broadcast from their perspective. So in a similar vein to Liz, it wouldn't be saying, I am going to ask you X, Y, and Z, because that does sound very contrived, but it's also just giving them the parameter of what it is you're looking for. I am going to ask you about this. What I want to achieve from that for our learning podcast today is that, so that they get an idea of potentially where you're steering the ship, and you're just giving them a seat on the bus, so to speak, ship, bus, whichever one you like, but you know, it's all going somewhere, one of those.
There we go.
Hi. I don't know your podcast, but I understand that it's like interview style, and you say you don't prepare the people on the podcast. As a content creator, I am thinking about using podcasts sometimes instead of a part of the typical e-learning. So let's call it a-learning or whatever. But in my mind, I would do it more scripted or more like storytelling, not just interviewing, but having a story and maybe some sound design and bits and that. I don't know if you have any experience or tips on that, on how to script and read it, because it won't be that spontaneous, but it shouldn't also sound like somebody is just reading a copy from a piece of paper.
Yes. So there are, as Andrew sort of explained earlier, there's lots of different styles of podcast, and they're all relevant. So I've chosen to mainly go down the interview route, but I have done some solo episodes as well. And when I'm doing those, I don't tend to write a full script, but I will write myself some bullet points that I want to get across during that episode. And what I find is that doing those solo episodes take far longer than doing an interview. Because when you're on your own, you can go back and re-record it again if you're not quite happy. And I'm sure a lot of you, like me, are a bit of a perfectionist. Oh, that wasn't quite right. I'll go back and do it again. So bear in mind, if you're going to do a solo episode, it might take you longer than you think it's going to.
Something I would add to that, which I won't put on the recording, is one of the most popular podcasts was Serial. Sure. Yeah? And I get where you're coming from. Build a narrative which you, over 3, 4 episodes, 5 episodes, you pull back layers. That could be really interesting. I get absolutely where you're coming from. I'll come here, then come back to that. Well,
Thank you. I'm looking for some editing tips. A lot of this is spoken to me. I've got a podcast that it's not about learning, but it's about comparing culture and celebrating women. That's our tagline. So it sort of links in with some of this. it's taking me forever to edit, and that's what's stopping us getting the podcast out with any frequency. Also, it's sort of a hobby for me and my podcast partner. I'm thinking about changing the software that I'm using. Currently, it's doing everything from recording to editing to distributing as well, so it's all completely linked up, which is really helpful. But I'm thinking perhaps, given the editing is taking so long, maybe I need to rethink what I'm using.
So tips for editing. Well, I try and do as little editing as possible for my podcast. So as I explained, when I have my guest and we're about to start recording, I will tell them we're not going to stop, unless the postman comes to the door, which does happen sometimes, or the dog starts barking. To be honest, I often leave the dog barking in these days, so that the editing is then very quick and easy. So unless something untoward has happened during that interview, I'm not going to touch it. All I'm going to do is, like Andrew does with his podcast, is put on top and tail it, and it goes out like that. All I can say is it just gets better with time and practice. When you start editing, it's a steep learning curve. When I started not doing podcasting but doing voiceover, I was using a free piece of software called Audacity, which is available to everybody. That's quite easy to use. I now use something called Adobe Audition, which you have to pay a subscription for. That's for my voiceover work, so I'm also using that for the podcast. But it isn't necessary to subscribe to software in order to make a podcast. You can do it. You can do that for free. But yeah, it is just a learning curve. And if you can find a format like me where you don't have to do much editing, then that's the way to go.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think that one of the things also to think about is that, if you try and do as little editing as possible, it's a much more authentic form of communicating with somebody. And they start to get through that meet, like, no trust process just by feeling confident that what they're listening is an accurate projection of what you want to be about, and it doesn't feel too manufactured. And that really actually does help with engagement, and it helps with people feeling confident enough to engage after the event as well. Whatever your call to action is at the end, whether you want there to be some discussion, or, as Andrew was talking about as a presentation, you're getting people to do activities between series and episodes, however you're producing it. If you are over-editing, then quite often people will switch off. I've just finished a project doing a short series of episodes around a specific learning topic, and the initial brief was to have a very sterile environment, and I actually fed back and said, I just don't think that's going to work, because what we're talking about, the learning objectives that you've got, the people who are going to be doing this stuff, they are not going to be in a sterile environment. As Liz was talking about, many of us are still working from home, or at least, hybrid, more at home than not. Liz and I share the same challenge of barking dog, and I also have the additional challenge of low-flying aircraft, just go with that one. So, I think just think about, how do you want your listener to feel? And if you want them to feel like it's an authentic conversation, then take Liz's advice and just keep it really, really simple.
The other thing I'd add on to that as well is think about the design. A magazine-style podcast, I'm producing a magazine-style podcast for an organisation. The editing on that takes ages because it's getting different bits and pieces and putting them together in a certain way. That takes an awful lot longer than a simple interview one. So think about the structure of the podcast, or maybe how you want to present it, and can you reduce the editing by the structure and the nature of your recording? Come here then to you.
If we're thinking about podcasts as part of a corporate learning environment where there's lots of different output formats, and podcasts could be one of them, what are topics that work particularly well as a podcast, and what are other things that probably want to be something else?
I think the best thing for me to do is to tell you about the sort of things that I've done. So, they are mostly about culture. So it will be having a conversation about company culture and the learning points in that, giving people the opportunity to dip in and out of it. So the project that I've just finished is to do with inducting people. So being able to give them audio access to some of the, well, frankly, boring bits. It gives them the opportunity to onboard quickly, and sometimes actually before they even get into the workplace. But then it also can be another sort of project I've worked on recently was having a series of podcasts explaining a project that a company was about to start. So they were looking to introduce mentoring in the workplace, and what they wanted was a series of short episodes to explain not only the difference between coaching and mentoring, but what the role of the mentor was to be in their workplace and what the role of the mentee was, what the expectations were, so that people had the opportunity to listen to all of those before they made the decision about whether or not they wanted to be a mentor or indeed be a mentee. So that's certainly the kind of stuff that I get asked to produce in the learning development world, is either things that you are pushing out there a lot, it's repetitive content, and you don't really want to have to do that face-to-face or one-on-one all the time, but also looking for different ways to share that. So instead of, as Andrew was saying, somebody sat in front of a video losing the will to live after about the first 90 seconds, that you're breaking it down into shorter chunks, really focusing on the nitty-gritty, and then making it available in those ways. So that's certainly the kind of things that I'm working on and have been for about the last 14 months or so. That's what comes up time and time again.
Another one I'd add, again, I'll edit this bit out. This is the great thing, you see, because all the recording, I can just edit out my voice. It's cool. The other thing that I'd be doing is I'd be looking at more people-related skills and personal-related skills. I wouldn't think of doing a podcast around process, but something around, okay, so how did you get where you are? The resilience piece. You know, the culture piece absolutely falls in that. You know, how do we do things around here? What are the voices of all the senior leaders? Actually, just thinking, getting that out. Because there's no point sending emails, just do some audio with it.
In structuring your conversation, so you both want to have natural conversations, but you create some questions beforehand, but what else do you do in order to, maybe the person you're interviewing isn't even aware of it, but what do you do in the background and how you structure and navigate the conversation?
Okay, so preparation. So something else that I always ask my guests to do is in advance of the interview, I will get them to send me their headshot and a short bio and any links that they want me to include in the show notes. Because what I do once the episode is published, I will post about that on LinkedIn using their headshot, using what they've told me in their bio, and I will tag them in that so they know that it's gone live, and then I will encourage them to share that with their audience as well. Something else I do, and something I forget to tell people about this is something that goes on after the podcast has been done. I send my podcast episodes to my local community radio station because they were looking for business content. And I said, well, I have this content that's gone on my podcast. Would you like that? And they said, yes, please. And I often forget to tell people that as well as it going out on my podcast, it will also be heard on Barton FM too. So that's just a little extra thing that people get from coming on my podcast.
It's also interesting that that's something that the hospital that's local to me has also picked up on, is looking for podcast content from local contributors to blend into their hospital radio, because there is only so much Alan Freeman reruns you can listen to. It's also thinking, how else could that value be added, and bringing in those conversations. And I just wanted to pick up on a little bit for the previous question as well, is that another way that podcasts can really help is by sharing stories of people in the workplace. So if you're trying to emphasize a particular element of your culture and you can get someone to come and talk about how it's benefited them, that is so much easier and better than trying to do that in some kind of written document that doesn't get read. Bringing that into the piece as well can be very interesting.
I think the more that you can do that's kind of story-based, the better, really. So on my podcast, I will ask people about how they came to be doing what they're doing in their current business, and then sort of their networking story, really, and what they get from networking. And I've had some brilliant stories from people, and and that's what engages the listeners, because we all love a bit of storytelling, don't we?
We do. We absolutely do.
Again, I'll add, because I have to have a last word. I send to all my guests, I send a podcast guide, so a recording guide, a guest guide. You're going to be a guest on the podcast. These are the things that we'll be doing. This is why you're going to feel nervous. This is what it's not. It's not an advertorial kind of thing. You can do this, don't do that. These are the people you want to think about. This is the questions you might want to think about as well. when I'm doing the podcast, actually recording, I'm in the room when the recording happens, but I don't speak. What I do is listen intently to what the guests are saying, and then I find the really interesting stuff and put those as links so that I can put them into the show notes. Show notes are essential for a podcast because that's the thing people will go back to and say, well, they spoke about this, where was it? And if you've got good show notes, people will come back to you again and again and again. I mean, show notes, how long do your show notes take you?
Well, not that long, and I tend to base my show notes on what the guest has sent me. So I might talk a bit about what we talked about in the podcast, but then I will also put extra information about their business and links to their websites and so on, because I want it to be of value to them as well. They can direct their audience to this piece of content that talks about their business, and their audience will find all their links in there as well. So I don't spend a lot of time on it. I tend to use a lot of content that the interviewee has sent to me.
Hello. Can you tell us a little bit about the steps you take to avoid potential legal issues? So, and you just mentioned about things they can and can't say, but do you get people to sign a disclaimer beforehand, giving you permission to use the recording how you want? Or do you give them a list of things that perhaps are a bit too sensitive?
So I haven't gone down that route at all. I mean, I tend to be talking to people about their own businesses. So they, obviously they have permission to talk about their own business. I don't think I've had anybody swear yet on my podcast. You have. Andrew has on his podcast. So it goes out as not content suitable for children, but it's not mature content. So I don't expect people to be swearing on my podcast, and I haven't had that. But no, I haven't done anything around sort of legalities in that sense.
I think it's a little bit different from my perspective, because quite often I have quite a strict brief about what a company that wants to work with me, or gets me to work for them rather, what they want. So when I've got that hat on, when I'm wearing that business hat, I'm quite obviously have quite a strict brief. And I think particularly if I'm being asked to produce content that is process-based, as in culture-based, and getting people to understand, there will be quite a lot of, we want you to talk about this in a positive way, we want you to ask these questions in a positive, we want positive reaction. And that then is down to me as the podcast host to make sure that the person that I'm going to be talking to understands that that's what I'm looking for. Now, it's completely different when I'm podcasting for my own business. Sorry, Liz. But it is completely different, because I'm all about helping people find their authentic voice through coaching. So I have had some fairly robust conversations through some of the podcasts that haven't gone out just yet, because it is somebody talking to me in their authentic voice, and that has occasionally got a bit sweary. And and then I have to sort of sit there and think, well, I can't muffle that, because this person is known for being a potty mouth. So, I've just got to, it's a bit like watching Adele, she sings like an angel, but by golly, what a mouth. And it's that, and that can be quite surprising. So I think, if there are areas where you're concerned, it really is just having a think about giving people the brief, making sure they understand what you expect. And if there are areas that you need them to avoid, red flag it really robustly. But if you're podcasting for your own business or interviewing other business owners, just be prepared, because you never know what you're going to get.
I'd just add, from a disclaimer point of view, when I'm producing podcasts for other organisations, there is a disclaimer which I ask the guests to sign, fundamentally because it's how will that content be used in the future.
Yeah, that's what prompted my question when you said you made it available to the radio station or the TV station.
Radio station, yeah.
That may not have been in the original brief, or they may not realise it was going to be used in that way.
Yeah.
Sorry. So we're trying to implement podcasts for internal communication, and of course one of the challenges is that in order to make it a case and get the budget for that, because most of the platforms, they require payment, I need to test it out. And yes, you can send in an email on Slack, the MP4, MP3s, podcast or something like that. Do you have any tips of alternatives and maybe other platforms that are free and available for internal communication when it comes to podcast format?
Over to you on that one, Liz.
Okay. I don't exactly. So the platform that I'm using is called Captivate. you can have a free trial, but it's only 7 days. I don't know about other platforms. I think Anchor is free.
But it's not, that's the problem, that it's open to everyone, so it ends up in... Yeah, the problem of that, it ends up in Spotify and all of that, and the idea is that it's internal communication, that, you know, you have a town hall, you have those long emails from the CEO, so we're trying to have our own podcast, and what's happening is now video format, and then our LMS doesn't accept, you know, the MP3 experience, so ultimately it's then actually a video, you have to be in the platform, you have to be in secure internet, la la la, so it defeats the whole purpose of the podcast while you walk or you're going to the office.
Okay.
Yeah, so my answer is I don't know, because, you know, I only know the platform that I'm using, so I'm not sure about that.
My answer would be record it. You can record it through any tool you want. If you use Audacity as a mixing tool, you can export it as an MP4 video file. And by doing that, then that makes it available for it to be loaded directly on your LMS. Yeah. The other thing you can do is you can think about, well, actually, do I want to use it as audio with, added to, say, a PowerPoint slideshow or a PowerPoint slide? So then you upload it as a PowerPoint show, and then people can still listen to the audio through their laptop.
Yeah, so there's no, so we're not doing it wrong, basically, there's no solution as a...
There's not an easy solution yet, no. The alternative would be to put it onto somewhere like a Spotify platform or somewhere. But instead of doing Spotify, you can go to somewhere like Podbean. You can record and put a certain number of hours on there, but you could lock the podcast down to only access via a certain code. So there's that potentially as well, or people with a secure link. Definitely worth investigating.
Yeah, I was trying.
Ooh. I was expecting we might have had 3 or 4 questions.
Just as sheer coincidence, I've been in a very similar position as the previous question, and we found a solution was to go through Microsoft Stream, and that was accessible to staff through that way. I've got an incredibly dull technical question. Do you use audio beds, and do you find that there's any dynamic difference between that and a podcast recorded to silence?
So the way that I record my podcast is I have a home studio because I'm a voiceover artist. So I do have a proper audio treated space to record in. And then what I do is I created a top and tail for it, which I do have a music bed for that, which I used it's a database called Audio Blocks, which you have to pay for a subscription to, but then all the music and the sound effects in there are royalty free. So that's what I use for my intro and outro, but the rest of it is just recorded in my booth, which has a lovely low noise floor.
Any more questions? Oh, back to Shannon.
Not really a question, but an answer to the lady who asked earlier. There are internal podcast companies. One of them is Storyboard. I don't know if it's free, but you can host your internal podcast through there, and it can be a secured area, so you do not have to, because if I understand your question, it was people just simply are not going to log into an LMS to listen to a podcast. They're just not going to do that. Yeah. So now what's the alternative? So Microsoft Stream was the first one that came to mind, but I knew that there was another one, and it's called Storyboard.
And actually, as soon as gentleman at the back said Microsoft Stream, it's like, duh. Yeah, you know, it was, because, you know, obviously what I'm doing is producing content that is being shared internally. I don't have access to, or I'm not involved in the process of platform, but, you know, using Stream is a great way of being able to get that content out there within that organisation. So, yeah, have a look at that.
Okay. Haven't they done a great job? A round of applause, please. I'm acutely aware you might have questions that you don't want recorded. I'll stop this recording now. I'm acutely aware you might have questions you don't want recorded. You might have other questions you might want to ask us. I have to make a massive apology because it's Miriam, isn't it, not Helen. I've been calling you Helen, sorry. No, I did. I felt bad about it. I'm going to be around for a little while longer if you want to chat. You've got my contact details up there. You've got Liz's contact details out there as well. More than happy to talk you through anything else that you might have around podcasting. Thank you for your attention. Last session on day 2 is always going to be a challenge. And like I said, I thought we might have had 3 or 4 questions. You've taken us to 4:45. They're serving drinks in a minute. I can hear corks popping. So thank you very much. Really do appreciate your time. Thank you.